Greetings, listeners. I hope you're comfortable and you have the lights turned down low. In a world full of questions, the unknown frequently rears its ugly head. At any time, any of us can face the unexpected, the supernatural, the unknown. Join me now as we journey through the fringes of horror. I am your host, Random British Dude, and it is now time for the Random Horror Theatre. Mr. Hudson was an ordinary man. He had an ordinary job, meandered through an ordinary life, and lived in an ordinary home. However, his life will take a sudden turn into the extraordinary, as you're about to hear. During Mr. Hudson's usual walk back home, something very unusual indeed had manifested into his life. Mr. Hudson was a few streets away from his abode when he was struck with a sight that both shocked and confused him. Before him sat an old antique shop. Now, listeners, I know that there's nothing unusual about an antique shop. However, this particular shop was not there yesterday. In fact, what was usually there was an ordinary brick wall. Before Mr. Hudson could process the hundreds of questions that flooded into his mind, a voice struck up which almost caused Mr. Hudson to trip over backwards. "Good morning, Mr. Hudson. Come to visit my old shop again?" The stranger smiled at Mr. Hudson with the familiarity of an old friend. In fact, however, Mr. Hudson had never seen this man before in his life. Just as he was about to open his mouth in response, the stranger had struck up in conversation again. "Oh, that reminds me, sir. I've cleaned up that old box you asked me to polish. Come with me. It's just in the back." Before Mr. Hudson could process the chain of events, he found himself following the friendly shopkeeper, like out of some kind of polite habit, and was waiting at the counter. "Here it is, sir, as good as new. No extra expense, sir. It's polished up fairly quickly with little effort, so it's all right." Mr. Hudson looked down at the antiquated box in the shopkeeper's hand. The pattern on the box was actually rather beautiful. Carved figures of unknown origin danced around the box in intricate poses and patterns. Mr. Hudson looked the shopkeeper in the eyes and said, "Listen here, sir. I'm afraid you have mistaken me for someone else. I have never been in this establishment before, and I've certainly not ordered any antique box." The shopkeeper burst out into a fit of laughter as he put his hands on the back of Mr. Hudson and guided him to the door. "I've always said you have a wicked sense of humour, Mr. Hudson. You do brighten my day, sir." Mr. Hudson stood in the front doorway, staring compounded at the box in his hand. By the time he had taken his eyes off the box, he had found himself stood upon the threshold of his own front door. He told himself he must have made his journey during his shock. Shaking his head with a heavy sigh, Mr. Hudson unlocked his front door and stepped inside. As I stated at the start of our story, Mr. Hudson had an ordinary home. At the moment, however, he had seemed to invite the extraordinary into his quaint little abode. Where had the antique shop come from? What was in the antiquated box? Let us continue with the story as we unravel the strands of this inexplicable mystery. Mr. Hudson went to bed that night extremely frustrated and upset. Not only was the events of the day playing in his mind, but he unsuccessfully tried to open the box. After many hours of attempts, he did, however, succeed in falling to sleep. He told himself as the waves of sleep washed over him that he will walk to the antique shop in the morning and resolve this mystery once and for all. Mr. Hudson shot out of bed, sweat pouring down his face, heart racing as if he had just been sprinting. From downstairs he could hear a faint collection of voices. At first paralyzed with fear, Mr. Hudson was too scared to move. Gradually, however, he crept out of bed with the bedside table firmly clasped in his hand. As he got to the top of the stairs, the voices had become stronger. He could make out cries of help, weeping, screams. as though he was stood at the very gates of hell. Out of sheer curiosity and terror, he descended the stairs, step by step. When he had made it to the foot of the stairs, the voices were painfully loud. He placed his hand over his ears and he yelled, "Shut up! Shut up!" Then all of a sudden, deathly silence. Mr. Hudson pushed open the living room door and scanned the darkness, squinting. His gaze swept the room from right to left until his eyes fell in horror on the table in the center of the room. There stood the box. The very same box he had brought home that day. The antique box. And the lid was open. At first, Mr. Hudson was too scared to move again. It took some time before he started to, but slowly, step by step, he crept towards the open box. Soon, Mr. Hudson was stood towering over the box, peering into the abyss inside. The only problem was, the abyss stared back. Mrs. Miller was almost home when a voice called out and froze her in her tracks. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller. Come to visit my humble shop again. Oh, that reminds me. I have that box you asked me to polish. It's just in the back here." As Mrs. Miller walked home in utter confusion with the box in her hand, she thought she heard a faint voice whisper. A voice the listeners would recognize as Mr. Hudson. You've heard the saying, "Do not take sweet from strangers." Well, I think we can safely add antique boxes to that saying, don't you agree? I think so. Next time you're walking down a quiet street, perhaps you should keep walking if something ever seemed, I don't know, a little different. Thank you for your time, listeners. Please join me again next time as we take a journey through the random horror theatre again. I am Random British Dude, and good night.